The CEO that wants to get ahead of that game will realize that the secret to success is in unlocking everyone's potential by seeing and understanding risk. When you see and understand risk, then you can get ahead of the competition in the sense that you can produce better outcomes and be more resilient when downturns occur. This translates into, from the high consequence world that I grew up in, to the business world, to the family environment. We don't manage our children the same way we often manage our employees, because we are, as parents, risk managers. And we try to pass on to our generations behind us the ability to see and understand risk. And yet with employees, we become very rule-based and outcome-based. And rules and outcomes will get us some result, but it will only get us so far if we're not willing to be proactive.
Here's something to get curious about. What if the greatest threat to your empire isn't failure, but the illusion that you're safe? Let me ask you, when was the last time somebody told you your systems are silently bleeding out beneath your brilliance? Today's guest isn't here to flatter your strategy or even bow to your charisma. He's here to show you where your leadership doesn't even know it's blind. Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I advise high-performing leaders and organizations how to harness their emotional source code to purposefully transform their tribe. Today on the Dov Baron Show, our guest for the next two episodes is Scott Griffith. Now, Scott Griffith has built the risk mitigation system that redefined aviation safety worldwide, cutting fatal crashes by over 95%. He's a force behind collaborative high reliability, that's with an R, registration, and just culture. Two frameworks so effective they are now used in hospitals, airlines, government, and high consequence industries around the globe. But don't confuse him with some kind of a systems guy. He's not just about protocols, he's about perception. And he's got one piercing message for top-tier leaders. If you can't see the risk before it sees you, your power is borrowed, and the system will call on that debt. More on that in a moment. You're tuned into the Dov Baron Show. Each episode is an exploration of the minds that are shaping the world. Every episode is a raw, unscripted collaboration between my guests and me as we dive into truths that few really have the courage to ask. We find guests for you who are sometimes unknown to the general public, but absolute titans, much like our guest today, in their field. The kinds of people that high-profile leaders turn to when they need an edge. If you're the kind of leader who really craves and longs for depth over sound bites, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is where real thinkers come to sharpen their edge. For the next two episodes, it's not just about improving your leadership, it's about protecting everything that you've built from one force you didn't see coming, and that is your own outdated operating system. Scott Griffith doesn't just fix broken systems, he exposes the illusions elite leaders live inside of. And he hands you a mirror, maybe that you've been avoiding. So because you may have doubled down on control and charisma to have certainty, that won't work. Turn up the volume and help me to welcome a man who has rewired entire industries, who was a commercial airline pilot who walked away from a catastrophic crash and then took leave of absence to work with NASA as a physicist, where he developed a wind shear prediction system that later flew aboard the space shuttle. He's the author of The Leader's Guide to Managing Risk, Mr. Scott Griffith. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Dov, for that high-energy introduction, perhaps highly caffeinated as well. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, mate. It's really good to have you here. You know, I was reading through your material, and I said to you before we came on, I really like the way you're challenging things. I think that oftentimes, you and I talked about this just a moment ago, the things in leadership tend to be sort of talked about in this trivial or generalized way, and you're really sort of pushing the boundaries on this. It's not only needed, but I think it's desperately needed. But I think that for change to take place, this is my opinion, for change to take place in anything, I've seen this in my own life. I've seen it in the lives and the businesses of the people I work with. Oftentimes we have to be confronted with something that is often dramatic or catastrophic. and then we go, okay, I got to wake up. You witnessed a catastrophic crash and you walked away. Talk to us about that crash and then how that changed you or redirected you.
I think, like any individual who's confronted with a reality that causes cognitive dissonance or something that rocks your world, in essence. I was a young commercial pilot, and I had put all my trust, my life, in fact, in the hands of technology and training and becoming a pilot. And then to see something take place in front of my eyes, I found myself, having cognitive dissonance and asking myself, how could this have happened? And as I dove deeper into the science of it, I began to realize that the world is filled with risk that organizations and individuals don't fully see and understand. So in essence, the plane crash you're describing took place on August 2nd, 1985. It was caused by something, Dov, called a wind shear microburst, which you're well aware is an intense downburst of wind that when it strikes the ground curls up in these vortices. And it's invisible to the human eye unless it's embedded in some sort of rain or other phenomenon. But for the pilots of this particular crash, they could see the rain showers, which were just normal summer rain showers. But what they didn't see and didn't understand was the threat in front of their aircraft. And so when I took a leave of absence, as you mentioned, I worked as a physicist to help develop a LIDAR system to detect and measure wind shear in the absence of water, so you could detect these wind fields in clear air. But that became a metaphor for me in my professional life. How many other plane crashes are caused? We're facing one here that just happened less than a month ago in India, and the world is waiting to find out what happened. Whatever it was something that the airline didn't fully see and understand. And so that became a metaphor for my business life.
You brought up a couple of things here that I want to jump back on, which is, first of all, 2025 has been a very interesting year so far from a point of view of plane crashes, because we seem to have seen a lot more of them at a commercial level than we've seen in years before. Of course, there was the one with India. The plane just took off and then suddenly crashed very quickly. But we've seen others where planes are just dropping and it doesn't seem to make sense. Air travel is still the most safe way to travel. It must be very different for someone like you compared to someone like me, some schmuck who knows nothing about airplanes, to go, holy crap, what's happening? Versus you looking at it, you must see it very differently. I just want that perspective for a minute. What's that like?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Doug, because the public's perception of any subject relies on media, relies on our interpretation of what we see and hear. The statistical world we live in, and I like to say that the world that we live in is not random. It's filled with probabilities, which are influenced by our heredity and our environment and the choices we make within those constraints. But for any mathematical system like aviation, I'm curious as to what goes on below the surface, and what the public sees are just the close calls and the actual accidents, which are, I use the metaphor in the book, of the tip of the iceberg. It's a really tiny fraction of the risk in our everyday national airspace system. But what I'm very curious about is how organizations can collect information and then see the patterns in the chaos. Because we live in a world filled with risk. And I like to say for the leaders out there listening that the best leaders aren't risk averse. Some of the most successful people that we admire are people that took risk, but we hope that they are risk intelligent. Getting out of bed in the morning carries a risk. Getting in a car, driving to work, or the foods we eat. But we do these with purpose, and we get enjoyment or we get some reward for them. But the science behind this says in order to build systems, in order to manage people, we must first see and understand the risk. Otherwise, any system we build or however we choose to manage people won't be optimal if we haven't matched our actions to the risk in front of us. And that's what's very difficult about an uncertain world. Whether you're thinking of financial markets or supply chain distributions or the threats in an aviation environment or a hospital, Those threats will evolve over time, and cultures in the workforce will change with leadership. I like to say in cultures, any organization will have different cultures in different departments, different cultures within those departments, and then the night shift in your business may be very different in terms of its culture than the day shift. But seeing and understanding that for a leader is absolutely essential before you go forward and manage it.
What you're saying there is obviously very important, is that risk intelligence, and I know that that's a big part of what you talk about. And something I do want to come back to, I hope we get time to do, which is, you mentioned LIDAR, which to me is a fascinating area and may not be part of this conversation, but I know, for instance, LIDAR is being used now to show entire civilizations in the Amazon that we didn't know existed. We had no way of knowing was existed, but it's LIDAR that's revealed things to us. I want to create a little bit of curiosity hook here, because maybe we'll have another conversation about it later. But explain to people what LIDAR is, just so they can understand it, versus radar or scanning or whatever it is you might do.
Right. So LIDAR is the acronym for light detection and ranging. And radar is the radio wave or microwave equivalent to that. It involves high frequencies associated with lasers, and there's different types of lasers. I'm glad that you mentioned the monitoring of the environment and the rainforest. That's one way. It allows you to see and penetrate beyond the visible spectrum, so what you wouldn't see with a camera, perhaps. But we're seeing them on autonomous vehicles. You'll have them on certain brands of mobile phones like iPhones. They're very good at detecting shifts in frequency. So when you send a light signal or a laser beam out into space, it's a very concentrated beam. It can be continuous or it can be a pulse system, but it has a set frequency. And then when it strikes a particle in the air, it could be dust particle or it could be other types of particles. It'll either be absorbed by the particle or refracted, and a tiny fraction of it will reflect back to the source of the signal. And from that source that you receive, or that wave that you receive back, you can detect a tiny shift in the frequency. We call that a Doppler shift, which is the radio velocity with respect to the receiver. And you can tell whether that particle is moving away from you or toward you.
And that's really cool, because like I said, they've been able to find where civilizations we didn't know existed.
Absolutely.
And we've sent archaeologists in there before, and we've done radar, and we've done all the different things and never even knew they were there. And then we find these cultures through LIDAR. And I've seen some of the imaging. It's pretty amazing to see what we had not seen, including, for instance, like pyramids that we thought were hills.
Yes.
You know, it's just like, no, this was built by human beings. It's pretty cool stuff. So you're using that same technology to show threat or risk where it would be generally invisible to us. Is that correct?
Yeah. So 1985, the state of the industry was that airplanes can, and still do today, they have radar, which is a means of sending a microwave signal out in front of the aircraft. And then when there's water droplets in place, it absorbs some and refracts some, and some are sent back. But it paints a picture based on the water droplets. But in this particular accident, there was no water involved. It was just invisible wind. And so the pilots couldn't see it, and their radar could not detect it. And so we went out and designed and prototyped a system that could do it in clear air. As you mentioned, it was test flown on the space shuttle, and it was proven that the science behind it worked, and they started building them. Today, they don't put them on airplanes, but they put them in airports. So you'll have them in virtually, I believe, every major airport in the world has a LIDAR system that helps detect wind shear along the flight path. So the air traffic controllers can then alert the oncoming planes to the dangers ahead that they can't see.
In the simplest possible terms, forgive my simplicity here, but it's making the invisible visible.
Great way to say it. It's illuminating, making the invisible visible. It's helping to detect the patterns in the chaos. The human eye has a relatively narrow range in the visible spectrum that we can see, but there's so much going on in the world around us that's detectable through these technologies.
Let's go further and let's talk about your microburst work with sort of socio-technical approach to leadership. You engineered this wind shear detection system for NASA that later flew on the shuttle. That's given you, I would imagine, a rarefied experience of integrating physics into human systems and real-world consequences. And maybe, I would guess from what you've said and what I've read, shaped your ability to see risk before other people can. And you've applied that to modern organizations. Talk to us about how that works. There's one thing, a very physics thing, and another thing in a very sort of, quote, cultural thing or people thing.
So, like you, Dov, I have a variety of interests, and I find the people like yourself who I connect with are people that can see the world through different lenses, whether it's through science or art or imagination. There's three disciplines that fold into the work that my company does. There's engineering science or system science. There's human behavior. When we say the word socio-technical, we mean people, socio, working in technical environments. So we live in a socio-technical world. So there's the human behavioral and the neuroscience behind that. And then there's a third piece, which involves the legal system. And why do we mention that? Because that's the way societies have held people to account in systems of justice. And I like to say when you compare those three disciplines, the engineering sciences, the behavioral sciences, and the legal systems, that engineers don't think like real humans. Engineers think like engineers. And the behavioral scientists don't necessarily understand the engineering principles behind systems design. And the lawyers don't think like any of us. I used to make jokes about attorneys until my oldest daughter recently graduated law school and passed the bar. And so she sent me an email saying, cease and desist, Dad, no more jokes about attorneys. But the legal system, I want to touch on that for a moment because the laws have evolved over time to serve a function in our society. But that function isn't primarily to manage risk. It's to do something else, to compensate those who have been harmed. In most justice systems around the world, to have what they call standing in court, you have to show evidence of or proximity to harm. That's a terrible way to parent your kids, wait for something to go wrong. It's a terrible way to run a business, wait for the plane to crash or the market to fall. We want to be prospective, and to do that, we have to move beyond the biases that are present in each of those disciplines I described. And to do that, we have to blend it in a way that goes sometimes beyond our own abilities, because most CEOs I know aren't engineers, behavioral scientists, and lawyers at the same time. But you have people who are experts in those fields that a great leader will bring those individuals together and learn to make beautiful music, to collaborate. The world-class musician can't perform at the level they perform without the right instrument. And the instrument maker won't necessarily know how to play, although they often do, but they don't see it in the same way that the legal system sees. So it's fun because you get to talk to people in different languages.
Well, most organizations, certainly that I'm aware of, measure outcomes financially or operationally, or maybe even through customer satisfaction. But as you say, waiting for bad things to occur is a very poor way to do risk management. And any business in its everyday life, that's a lot of what's going on. So how can we as leaders move from being reactive to proactive and seeing and understanding how to manage risk before it slaps us upside the head?
So I work in multiple industries that are often referred to as high consequence, meaning in the blink of an eye, catastrophe can result, a plane crash, a nuclear plant meltdown, a hospital where patients die. But any business is high consequence to those engaged in the business and perhaps to their customers. What I have learned over the years is that sometimes the threats or the risk resides external to the organization, where forces beyond your control, like what happened during the pandemic, during COVID, that came in from the outside. Other times, the risk is present in the operation, in the making of a product on a production line. And so where we start with what I call the sequence of reliability, which the first step, as you've already pointed out, is to see and understand risk. Sometimes in many of those high consequence industries, those risks are best seen through the employees doing the work. not the safety department, not the risk department, not the C-suite, but the people out there making the widgets or flying the planes or taking care of the patients. The interesting thing about people reporting risk is that humans, one, aren't rule followers by nature, and two, we don't report risk if we're part of the risk. Very few of us call our insurance agent after we drive home from work and say, hey, I just wanted you to know I drove over the speed limit and had a near miss here. We don't do that because we would be putting, some of our finances in jeopardy. Similarly, a pilot doesn't get off the plane and walk into their boss's office and say, hey, I had 3 close calls on my last trip. I just want you to know about it. So we had to shift the paradigm and understand what motivates people. And that's where the behavioralist came in.
I want to go into that. I want you to dig into that because I think it's really important. What you just said is really important, is that we're not setting up and going, hey, listen, I screwed up. And we're waiting for somebody to find out.
Yeah.
And as you said, the risk is if I come up and say, hey, I was driving over the speed limit and I just missed a couple of vehicles, but I'm okay. My insurance company isn't going to punish me for that. So I be quiet about those things. And it's the same across however we operate. There usually is a consequence. So how do you get people to that level of accountability before there's a problem?
So I know one way to do this. In 1994, we started a program in the airline industry that I developed called Aviation Safety Action Program. It was a collaborative effort between the airlines, the labor associations, and the Federal Aviation Administration. And we incentivized employees to come forward. Now, we started with pilots, but then we opened it up to mechanics and air traffic controllers and dispatchers and flight attendants. And we guaranteed that if an individual came forward in good faith, that there would be a collective response to that was going to be non-punitive or non-disciplinary. So a pilot could admit making a mistake and not lose their license. It revolutionized the industry in the sense that prior to that time, we were heavily regulated. We had professionals who were licensed, but they were fearful of losing that license or putting themselves in jeopardy if they were investigated by a regulator and the attorneys got involved and it could become a civil penalty.
Right.
So pilots were disincentivized to come forward, even if they were part of the risk. So we changed that paradigm and people started to trust the program. And so I've identified about 6 elements that are necessary for any organization to incentivize people to come forward. The first is when they come forward, you have to validate their concern. If you put out a suggestion box in your business and people start to put suggestions in, if you do nothing with it, they won't keep reporting.
No.
They'll stop. If you turn in a suggestion and then a week later your boss comes to you and has a word with you or criticizes you, you may not turn in other reports. So the reporting system needs to be confidential. It needs to validate the reporter. You need to provide assurances of appropriate use, what you will do with that information. If you're in a workforce that has labor and you have associations working on behalf of their members, they must be included so that it's seen as a partnership,
Right.
not just management taking information under advisement. All of this comes together in getting humans to come forward in what we would call doing the right thing. But doing the right thing is hard when humans are not rule followers by nature. I was laughing, Dov, because I took a picture of a car on a highway and it apparently was doing the speed limit. But if you ever question whether humans are rule followers, go out and get on any highway in the world, get in the left lane and drive the speed limit and watch the reaction of the cars around you.
Yeah.
And they'll get angry with you because in the United States where I live, people believe that the left lane is for passing, but the reality is there's only 3 states in America that allow you to exceed the speed limit when passing. Only 3. So we mistakenly think it's okay to speed when it's not. We've only been following rules for about 10,000 years as a species, but we've been playing with fire and running from the woolly mammoth for perhaps millions of years.
Right.
So humans just aren't wired to follow rules. And when we break a rule, It's not in us to come report.
So that to me is so fascinating, because what you're just describing seems to be against our very nature. And a lot of what you're suggesting, which is seeing and understanding risk, that appears to strongly run counter to the sort of leadership beliefs about how we're going to do. So how do you convince a skeptical CEO to rewire their organization's ontology rather than just put in a few more with HR?
The CEO that wants to get superior outcomes and exceed the competition has to realize that it's the old adage, it's better to be proactive than reactive. Well, the truth is that most businesses are reactive. We measure quarterly results, we measure productivity, but sometimes we get great results with very risky systems and very risky behaviors, and we accept those results, we applaud those results, we reward those results until the plane crashes or the market goes down and the business suffers. It's a roller coaster ride in an environment where we're always chasing the outcome. The CEO that wants to get ahead of that game will realize that the secret to success is in unlocking everyone's potential by seeing and understanding risk. When you see and understand risk, then you can get ahead of the competition in the sense that you can produce better outcomes and be more resilient when downturns occur. This translates into, from the high consequence world that I grew up in, to the business world, to the family environment. We don't manage our children the same way we often manage our employees, because we are, as parents, risk managers. And we try to pass on to our generations behind us the ability to see and understand risk. And yet with employees, we become very rule-based and outcome-based. And rules and outcomes will get us some result, but it will only get us so far if we're not willing to be proactive. So for those that are happy with status quo or happy with middle of the pack results, keep doing what you've always done, and you'll be middle of the pack. If you want to excel, if you want to get superior outcomes, or if you work in an environment where customer safety is paramount, if you want to stay in business, then you will do more than just the status quo. And that's what we did in aviation. It took a little while, but it didn't take long before we figured out that this was scientific and was going to produce superior results. And we did. The risk of dying on a plane crash today is roughly 1 in 8 million. And it remains about that level, particularly in the US. The public may be concerned, but the signs of alarm go deeper than what you see on the news. We really have to look below the surface to see what's actually taking place. I don't have the same alarm, although I do have some concerns in some areas, but it's the ability to pull back the curtain and see and understand risk, which will give us the ability to build better systems and manage people. But the CEO that's only looking for the results and looking at quarterly outcomes, they're going to miss the dominant risk ahead of them.
You talk about this, and obviously everything you're saying is reiterating it, which is we hear of emotional intelligence, we hear of intellectual intelligence, IQ, EQ, etc. And you're talking about risk intelligence. It's a very interesting thing, because in my work, working with these very high-performing leaders, it's really interesting to me to watch where they're willing to take crazy risks and where they're willing to take no risk. I was talking with a client of mine recently, as an example, that it's easier for him to donate 300 million to something than it is for him to donate $30 to something. Because $30, why would I waste $30 on this? But 30 million, it's this parts of our brain that work differently. Risk is not an equal thing. It's a very subjective thing. And you're talking about this sort of science of, which is a different thing altogether. That's why I really want to bring home this piece that you're having around risk intelligence.
Yeah, so one of my heroes among several was Daniel Kahneman, who was a Nobel laureate economist, who was actually a behavioral scientist. He was a human psychology professor. And what you're really describing, in my mind, is the proportionality.
Right.
when we look at the numbers. People fear flying on a plane, but I tell them it's the drive to the airport that you should be concerned about. There's two dominant risks when you go to fly on a plane. One is the drive to the airport. The second is catching some type of respiratory illness, a cold or a flu or a COVID virus. That's much more likely than you getting injured or impacted by a plane crash. But it's lack of human proportionality in seeing it. Andrew Kahneman goes deep into how we perceive risk in the moment and how we receive it or look back on it. He has a brilliant approach to saying that our brain is wired in two basic modes, and these are metaphors, but he calls it our thinking fast mode, or system one mode, and our thinking two mode, which is slow and deliberate. When you think of risk in your slow and deliberate mode, you look at the numbers, you look at the quantification of risk, the proportionalities, and you can make sense of it. But when you see a dog on the street and you have to decide in the moment, will it bite me or should I pet it?
Mm-hmm.
It's your fast one system one brain,
Right.
which is filled with perception bias.
Exactly.
And that includes racial bias, cultural bias, outcome bias, confirmation bias. There's a whole host of biases that invade the human brain, but we make fast decisions. Sometimes those fast decisions are right. Many times they're wrong. But in order to manage a business or a high consequence activity, we really need to slow down and think this through. And to do that, we need the ability to see and understand the risk. Instinct will get you something, and sometimes it will make you rich. But instinct alone won't bring the science to the table.
It's a really fascinating subject, and I'm really excited to go deeper into what risk intelligence really is and how we can apply it to our businesses. I want to make sure that we get into the depth of that. And we're already at the end of part one. So before we dive into part two of the show, I'd love for people to find out more about you, where they can find out more about your resources, your books, etc. Can you please tell people where they can find out more about you, Scott?
Sure. You can go to our website at sgcpartners.com. That's Sierra Golf Charlie for the aviation folks out there, partners.com, sgcpartners.com. Our website is filled with information about what we do as a business, and you can navigate to the information about my book as well.
Wonderful. We'll make sure, of course, that's posted in the show notes, along with any other social connections to Scott and his work, as well as the book. We're going to have more from Scott Griffith in just one click. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about your risk intelligence. Do you have it? Do you need more of it? Or have you been throwing it to the wind? I know I did. And then I fell off a mountain. But we'll talk more about that in just a moment.